there it is. The old ones are the best. I do keep telling myself that. So I regularly tell my daughters, I am funny. And they regularly remind me I'm not. Whilst laughing, I'd like to add. So if you have a Bible with you, whether you're home or away, please turn with me, please, to Ruth chapter 1. How exciting to be in the book of Ruth. And you could say, whose favourite or who likes the book of Ruth? Who enjoys it? I know it's kind of like I'm supposed to say yes to every book of the Bible. But the book of Ruth is often a book that kind of has a special place in a lot of people's hearts. Usually women in particular, they either like Ruth or Esther. You're a Ruth or you're an Esther kind of girl. Whichever you are, you're either prepared to leave your family and homeland or you're called for such a time as this kind of person. One or the other, you usually can tell if they're a Ruth kind of person, they're likely to go on mission. If they're an Esther kind of person, they're probably going to pastor a church. That's all complete fiction. I've just made all of that up. Please don't now make your entire life based on those statements that have just come out. Either way, you don't have to be a woman to enjoy Ruth. Just because that we are seeing a biblical character here, a feminine hero along the word that comes out, one of several that are in Scripture, and one that's got a real powerful message. But often this powerful message is understood in the whole of the 4 chapters. It can be quite difficult to grasp this picture when we look at it in its 4 different chapters. Because you break it down too much and you kind of get to the point of going, where are we, what am I doing? And so it is important to keep the whole picture in mind whilst we break down each part. And I'm going to entitle each one of these messages in the book of Ruth as Loves, and then a blank. And this isn't blankety blank, where you fill it in. But each week there will be Loves something. And today we're going to look at Love's resolve. Love's resolve. I'll let you have a think about that whilst we turn to the book of Ruth and we read chapter 1 together. And it says this. Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, and her 2 sons. Now they took wives of the women of Moab, and the name of one is Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion also died to the woman, so the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. Verse 6.
Then she arose with her daughter-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each of her to mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, Surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters, why will you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should say I have a husband tonight, and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her, and she said, "Look, your sisters-in-law have gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you, or turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." When she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Now the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened, when they had come to Bethlehem, that all the city was excited because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" But she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest.
Amen. Lovely story. Great kind of message. Who's never read the book of Ruth? So you've all definitely read it, which is good. It's a great one. Have we done Ruth in Sunday school? We have? Bits of it. So it's there. We've done it on our cafe churches through the Learn the Bible. There are bits that you've looked at it. And I'm going to make an outrageously strong claim now that tonight I'm going to teach you something that you didn't know about the book of Ruth. There you go. You can drag me out to the car park and stone me later if that's not true. But I am going to prove to you tonight, show you something that you may not have seen here in the book of Ruth. Now, it is important to remind ourselves that there's a reason that we're doing a series of not one book, but a series of books. And that isn't always the case, and we can't sit here and say the writers of all these books intended for all the books to be written together, because there's something about the writers of history, is that they are writing history, but they don't know what the future is yet to come. Only the Lord knows the future. And each one of them writes them. But this journey is taking us from the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, today and these next three weeks after it, the book of Ruth, then the book of 1 and 2 Samuel, which originally were one book. They kind of come together. And there's interesting things about them all, but the one thing that unifies them all together is they are historical books. And I don't know whether you've ever noticed this in the Old Testament. You may only really notice it when we do the Bible reading week, when we read the Bible over a week. And that is that the book of the Old Testament is set out in a kind of a bit of a neat format. You've got your law books of the first 5. Then you've got your history books. Then you've got your poetry books. And then you've got your prophetic or revelatory books. Now there is a kind of a bit of a mix in that because all the books are prophetic and revelatory. They've all got that midrashic thing that goes in. Some of the books that are in poetry are also law. Some of the books that are in the law are actually historical. So there is a confusion sometimes of a state. But literary, I probably aren't saying that right, but literary has lots of different genres, lots of different styles. And I know most of you, probably all of you, have heard me say this before, but it is important that we know that books of different genres are studied and looked at in different ways. So history books are not the same as law books. And poetry books are not the same as history books. And prophetic literature is also not the same as history books. And although there is an overlap, when we look at history, we have to study it in the way that it is. And that is important for us to grasp. But the problem that lots of people have when it comes to studying history is often the same way that people have a problem with doing any kind of Bible study. And it does bother me that even now, today, with the proof and the showing that there are so many churches out there that have got the least grasp of who the Lord is and the minimization of the word, that grown adults still fail to be unable to sit under any kind of Bible study. Now, I'm not necessarily talking this Bible study, because this is a long Bible study. Kind of say this is like coming out, shall we say, for a big meal. Not everybody's in for that. Some people like it in short doses. What bothers me is when you get people who can't do any kind of Bible study whatsoever. In fact, it's hateful to them, and they've got a kind of an answer to it. Well, I'm really about prayer and worship, and I'm really about these things. But without the word, it is impossible to know who God is. Now, we need to experience the Lord, and that's why prophecy, prayer, moving in the Spirit, these are faith-building exercises. But faith in what? And how many times, we've been doing this in Cafe Church, have we dispelled church traditional myths over various rituals and events, over various faith-based things, that when you get down to the brass tacks of what the word actually says, you start to realize, actually, we've been inventing quite a lot of stuff to answer difficult questions, instead of just going to the word and trusting in it. So it's important that we know that the Bible study is important, but the studying the history of Israel isn't just interesting. In fact, if there's a book that really declares why the history of Israel is interesting, but also vital, it's this book. And you might be wondering why, and we will explain why shortly as we go through this and through this chapter and through these characters. But history, or the history that's contained in the Bible, has another pull for us other than just instructing us on what happened to Israel. Because prophecy is pattern, what we see going on is something that we will see again. Solomon puts it in these words, there is nothing new under the sun. And as somebody who studied secular history, that's so true. It's surprisingly true. You see it over and over again, where events in human history seem to repeat themselves. Oh yes, the technology changes and the players change, and sometimes the size of it changes. So what we're reading here in the book of Ruth actually has for us a meaning to the church. And when we study any historical book that is in the Bible, not just any historical book, or you're not going to find anything that's patterned in Churchill's history of himself, but you are going to find in any historical book that's here in the Bible, you are going to find that there is, as well as what went on then, instruction on what will happen in the future. And this is a book that also is not devoid of that. So when we study together, you're asking firstly, why do they do that? What is that used for? But once you've understood what's going on to the people at the time, then you start to ask the question, how does this apply to the church? How does this apply to the church age? What is the lesson to our future to be gathered from this? And once we grasp hold of any history book, but particularly this history book, in this method, we are going to see to ourselves revealed the understanding of what comes. Now, in Matthew 24, what does Jesus say about the thief? When's he coming? Night. And what does he say about the householder? That's right. That if the householder had known when the thief was coming, then he would be ready. And then he reminds us that he isn't just talking about burglars, he's talking about himself here and the return of Christ, which was the question the disciples asked him. And he makes it abundantly clear. I'm telling you when I'm coming. And I'm going to come like a thief in the night. That to those who are unawares, to those who are asleep in their bed, they will not know I've been until everything. But he then goes on to say, don't let these things overtake you. Because we now know when the thief is coming. So we know to make sure that we've got lamps with enough oil in them. so that we're not like the foolish virgins who knew that the wedding party was coming but didn't prepare for it, because the bride is supposed to be preparing herself. So the history, the lessons that we receive from the book of Ruth are to give us the preparation that we might be ready and we might be in that place. So let's learn about how we might know when the thief is coming. So let's bring this together. What's the book of Ruth actually all about? You can just use the microphone for those that are online.
In the edition of Bible in front of me, it says Christ in Ruth. The family redeemer or kinsman redeemer, Boaz, is a type of Christ who is related to us by blood, able to pay the price for our restoration and willing to pay that price no matter what the cost to himself.
Amen. So we know about the kinsman redeemer. I mentioned it on Sunday. Is that just told anybody anything they didn't already know? Because I think we've talked about the kinsman redeemer on a number of occasions. Now, it's absolutely true. When we get to chapter 3 or 4, we will get to what the kinsman redeemer is. But the other side that Janet has showed there when she's reading that out, very clear and very important that you get it, exactly from what I've just said about the historical understanding, is that this has got a real point towards Jesus. But it's still a real book. And that means that to us, we New Testament Christians that now have the complete canon. But whenever this was written, and we're going to have a look at that, the time frame is clearly at the time period of the judges. So you're talking right at the beginning of the nation of Israel. All that we understand was not in their understanding. The bones not necessarily put on, although it all exists within the law, this history tells us about a future. It tells us about who Jesus is. He is a kinsman redeemer. And the Hebrew word is goa'el. But here's another word for goa'el. Another name that goa'el uses is the avenger of blood. So, and which is also a close family member whose job it is to avenge the blood that has been spilt of a family member. That's why people have the cities of sanctuary to run to, those places that they are safe as long as they are within the walls. And people think of the avenger of blood as the devil. The devil is out for me and I've got to run into Jesus to be saved. But the actual fact is, Jesus is our kinsman redeemer, or he's the avenger of blood. Remembering the words of salvation, whilst we were still his enemies. Now, there are many people out there in the world where God is their enemy. But it doesn't say, while God was still our enemy, he loved us. It says, while we were still God's enemy, he loved us. And when we know that's true and grasp hold of that, now we're starting to cook on gas a little bit. So this is the revelation of the kinsman redeemer. This character that was contained within the law, but unless you really were a student of the law, you may never have seen it. And the Lord had seen fit to put within the word for us an example of how a kinsman redeemer goes about their task. Now what that actually tells you is a kinsman redeemer is about redeeming the land. Remember, the book of Numbers ends bizarrely with a whole story about how to make sure you hold on to your inheritance. Remember, this whole going into the promised land was about your inheritance. The crime that Ahab and Jezebel commit against Nabal is because Ahab wants the land that was given to Nabal's forefathers when they crossed the land. Even the prayer of Jabez, Lord, enlarge the place of my tent, is about inheritance. It's all very, very vital and important. It's about the land that God has given you and what are you doing with what God has given you. And in this particular case, Elimelech has decided to leave it. Now think about that. Elimelech has decided that it's too hard. Now in Israel, in the law, there are many things he could have done. He could have sold his sons and his wife and himself into servitude for 7 years, in which case he would have been released. And after 50 years, or in the year of Jubilee, his land would have been returned to him, regardless of what his debt was that stood on it. So there was every aspect within the law that said, okay, you have mismanaged your affairs. In this case, it tells us there was a famine. Does anybody know what the name Bethlehem means? It means house of bread. Now consider that. This is a famine in the place where people get bread. So when a famine has got so far that it's actually hit the central hub of your bread making. It's like, when a year ago they had the carbon dioxide shortage. You knew it got bad when Warburton's couldn't make crumpets anymore. It's really got bad now. Crumpets are off the menu. And for somebody like me that likes a glass of pop all the time, I walk down the pop aisle in it with like a Russian supermarket. Just completely empty, nothing there whatsoever. All there, everything gone, nothing but vodka. Everything disappeared along the line. And it's the same here. So it may not be mismanagement, it may be their affairs, but at the same time, Boaz, who was a relation, or Boaz's family, who were related to Elimelech, did not do the same thing. They lived in the same place as everybody else there lived in the same place, but Elimelech decided, let's leave. And they left the promised land. They left the promised land. They even left the land of the east of the Jordan to go and reside with Lot's children, the Moabites. In essence, they've given up their inheritance, like the prodigal son. And that is the national identity that is being created here. Now, what's interesting about that is, have a look at what Naomi says at the end of the chapter, when we read it in verse 20 and 21. Yes, please, if you could.
Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, she answered, for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I left full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has pronounced judgment on me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?
Now, some commentators struggle with that, because they didn't leave full. They left because there was a famine. But Naomi wasn't somebody who worked in the field. Naomi was a mother in Israel. And to her, leaving full was leaving with a husband and 2 sons. And she came back with nothing. However, isn't it interesting that they decided to walk away from God, but who's getting the blame for the situation? And that's an interesting kind of place where you start and where you are. Now, let's get into this now. We're going to get into the book of Ruth. And these images start to come, and we can keep 2 eyes going here. An image on the eye of what's actually happening, and an eye on what this spiritually applies to in the church and the church age. By actually coming back to now and thinking about what is the book of Ruth all about. And one of the questions, for those of you on workplace, you have seen me ask, is often probably thought of as being far more pedantic than necessary to answer. But believe me or not, it is a vital one. And that is this a history book or is this a poetry book? Now, I already told you, genres are very different. And you might think, does it matter? This surely is a mooted point because it's in the historical section anyway. So we already know the answer to that question, rather than a poetical one. But funnily enough, in the poetical one, there is a book dedicated to love as well. And it gives us this great allegory, again, of the love of the beloved and the Shulamite, of Solomon and the Shulamite, of the church and Jesus. And lots of people debate whether that should be a poetry book or a history book. So both of these books struggle with the same thing. Now that's a poetry book. It is a poetry book. It blooming well is a poetry book. You know that because every verse has an interpretation of what it means. And sometimes it's quite rude. But it is a book that's an interpreted book. And you have to understand the poetry that's in there. But in truth, you might think, surely it's not important. But it is important to figuring out Ruth's actual message, its potential authorship, and of course its most essential point, what was it actually written for? Ultimately, what is the book of Ruth actually written for? And we can acclaim the understanding, but remember that this is the deeper meaning, the typological meaning. But there is a plain text meaning that is important that we grasp hold of that before we can grab hold of the typological point. All of these things we often actually don't consider. When was the last time you were worried about who the author was of the book of Ruth? Or even asked yourself, where in the Judges period does this go? Or even actually ask the final question, what is the book of Ruth actually for? Who was it written to? Why was it even written? We fall in love with the text so much because it's such beautiful text. And that's the problem, you see, when you look at it as a poem. Because we don't really consider it when the narrative is so beautiful. And therefore we allow its content to speak to us, and we make no interest in its context. But context is king. Without context, the contents often can mean little. And that's really important because we're going to make a leap. A leap that most Jewish people would say we have no right to make. That this is actually a story about Jesus, the church, and Israel. Naomi, Mara, walked away, left the inheritance, walked away from God, still blames God for it, is brought back by the Gentile. But the Gentile can only get the husband when Israel teaches the Gentile how to work around the traditions and the culture, how to understand the process. Because one of the questions you're all going to ask is, why did Ruth lie down at his feet? I mean, goodness me, how many times have you seen a proposal when somebody's woken up and found their intended lying at their feet and going, will you? It doesn't shout marriage proposal, does it? Or it does sound stalker and get out of my house quickly kind of thing that comes in. What does that mean? What's all this with the dipping that in? Why are they having a party? Why does he spit in her face and give her a shoe? What's all of this kind of thing about? Where does it come from? It requires the culture of Israel for us to understand the word. And when the church leaves Israel's culture behind and tries to study the Bible as either a Greek work or a book that's written to Gentiles, that's when we come up with the medieval church. And we are so far away from God's teaching that it doesn't make sense. Now, this isn't be Jewish, get circumcised, wear a kippah, keep the law, because Galatians tells us that all of that's fruitless. But this is a true understanding that unless we understand that this is a book that was written by Jewish people or Jewish converts, we will never grasp the meaning of the word. And ultimately, you can trace almost every biblical error back to when somebody detaches the Jewishness of the Bible and they try to study it like a different book, like a Greek book or like a Roman book, and they completely forget where they are. And so before we can make that leap, we've got to know what this is really about. So when we neglect the context, where is it, when's it based, why is this all written, just to this beautiful content story about a woman who gives up everything and supports her mother-in-law and lives with her in destitution, goes and works like a dog in the field, and then goes out and finds a man and everything lives happily ever after. we are getting a nice story. We're even actually holding on to the nature of God and his love for us. But we're missing the whole point and everything that is here to be taught. Because the problem is, when we just focus on such a beautiful narrative and we allow only its content without its context to speak to us, what we tend to do is romanticize this story. Oh, people do love to romanticize the book of Ruth. I mean, this is the classic kind of chick flick. Really out there, isn't it? Woman done good kind of thing. But this is the way that people, of course, they often think of this as like, Ruth, here's Ruth. She's this beautiful woman. Hard done to, but beautiful. And she's got the hair and makeup all in the right place. A woman with all the right parts. Everything's where it should be. And that she seduces, shall we say, charms Boaz. Hence why, in the end, using all of her womanly assets, she gets the man. And it's like a Mills and Boon book then at the end of it, that people kind of grab hold of it, that idea. There's one romantic. But here's another romantic story that I'm going to challenge. It's this idea that he falls in love with her. Where does it say that? Where's the expression here? There's a phrase that we'll come across. This is going to really scupper and ruin your romantic view of it. When Boaz wakes up and finds that there's a woman at his feet. Not the usual. But he finds a woman at his feet and she's uncovering his feet. Because apparently that's a thing. And he knows what it means. She hasn't a clue. Her mother just told her to do it. When you lie at his feet, take the corner of his garment and uncover it. Okay. That he immediately knows that and says, oh, this is the greatest thing that you've done, even greater than what you did in the field. Hang on a second. I, as a woman, have been working on the Jewish welfare system, which means with the other destitute women, I've been following the reapers behind and picking up what they don't get. So I've been on benefits this whole time. I've been working day in, day out, in the field, all the danger, and you're telling me that he's so ugly and old that he thinks that's more amazing than doing that he's prepared to marry. You can't say that. Boaz was meant to be this Mr. Darcy type guy. Strong. Muscles rippling. Walking out of the field. Wet hair with the greatest perfumes and spices that are flowing in the air. His beard shining. Smile that makes you go weak at the knees. There he is, coming out rugged and rough and exciting. Oh, Mr. Darcy. With the eye of a deer, even if he is a little bit older, he's probably a silver fox out there. It's the Cinderella story. But the problem with that is, of course, the Cinderella story is a made-up fairy tale. This is not a made-up fairy tale because this isn't a poetry book. It's a historical book. It's an historical narrative. And the reality of Boaz being an old man who thinks a young woman wanting to marry him is even more impressive than her being prepared to go on benefits and work all day for her mother-in-law, that says a lot about what he thinks about himself. That also means that she doesn't just marry him, she's prepared to have children with him. So she's giving herself to him and then takes that child and gives that first child to her mother-in-law as a replacement for her husband. And we'll get on to inheritance laws. In the last chapter, when you were going, what? This is a book of sacrifices, not of romantic interests. We like to think that love is always going to work itself out in the most beautiful and wonderful ways. But although this is a book about love, it's not a book about romance. Because it's not poetry. It's an historical narrative. And you have to ask the question, if it's an historical narrative, why have Israel got this in the book of their histories? Why is this romance novel their history book, in their history? Why not other things that could have been written? That's all important. But here's the last thing that might even throw a real spanner into your romantic view of what the book of Ruth is all about. It's something we've already seen. Turn with me to Judges chapter 12 and let's read verses 8 to 10 and see if you can remember this. Judges 12, 8 to 10.
He was from Bethlehem, judged Israel after Jephthah, and had 30 sons. He gave his 30 daughters in marriage to men outside the tribe, and brought back 30 wives for his sons from outside the tribe. Ibzan judged Israel 7 years, and when he died, he was buried in Bethlehem.
Can you remember who Ibzan was? Boaz. Ibzan means the splendid one of Bethlehem. And we looked at it at the time. Oh, hang on a second. No. He's supposed to just have Ruth and Obed. No, he's got 60 children. And I'm fairly certain they didn't all come out of Ruth. Otherwise, her children would have thought she was a short, fat woman all of her life. Because he had more than one wife. Oh, you've ruined Boaz for me now, Jamie. Boaz is meant to be this beautiful, wonderful, historical Mr. Darcy type character. And now you're telling me Ruth's just in the pile. And Obed's in there. You see, it does actually make a bit of sense. Obviously, this is after he does the kinsman redeeming. Otherwise, it would mention that he was a judge in the book of Ruth. So he becomes a judge after this is later in his life. In fact, the last 7 years of his life to which he is. And at that stage, he has all of these children. Now, the Jews universally believe that Ibzan is Boaz. It doesn't say Boaz, but it gives him the title, the splendid one of Bethlehem, which, of course, is the case. And either way, this is the time that Boaz would have been around. So it could have been another splendid one of Bethlehem, but Boaz was the chief, the area, the wealthy one of the town. If he is, then he had 60 children as well as Obed, and for some of us, that makes it uncomfortable, the idea of this wonderful love story being sullied by Ruth being just one of his wives. Now, of course, that is tradition, but a narrative we've brought into as part of our understanding of the history. So through the book of Judges, we've already accepted this as a statement. We've believed it, and we are going to work in that kind of place that it is. And as such, that causes you to take a realism pill over the book of Ruth. And acknowledge that the poetry, the beauty, and the romantic notions may actually be hindering your ability to absorb the message of the book of Ruth. So let's take all of that and let's throw it out the window and say we're going to let go of this whole love story, romance, beautiful heroine, romancing the stone kind of experience that's going on here. Showing my age. About 3 people in the room knew that. Yeah. That's it. And understand, this is a historical book, not a poetical one. Now do you understand why it's important that we know what genre it is? Because history books are different. A poetry book doesn't actually have to be real. It doesn't have to be true. It's poetry. Is the book of Job a real person? It is unimportant for us to know the truth of that. I believe it is. But it is unimportant. In the same way, is the story of the rich man and Lazarus an actual, the word's gone out of my head now, a parable, or is it a true story? Well, Jesus doesn't say, let me tell you another parable. It's a true story. So if you take these things in a sense, there's a real understanding. History is real. And if history is real, then it's been taught. And the least important history to teach when you are talking about national events is the love story between one guy and another girl, when he had a lot of other wives. There's something deeper and more important in the message, not just in the typology of the message to us and the understanding of Jesus as a kinsman redeemer, but the understanding of Boaz, Ruth, and Naomi, and all of those characters that are around into the history of Israel itself. But it is a really well-written history book, which is why people make the mistake. It is actually considered to be one of the most inspiring pieces of writing that exists in the Bible. And in Hebrew literature schools, secular Hebrew literature schools in Israel, in the same way that in English lit classes you are taught the classics, the Shakespeare's and the Brontes, they use the book of Ruth as being classic Hebrew, in the same vein as Shakespeare. Now, if you read Shakespeare, I don't know if you like Shakespeare. You might not be a fan of Shakespeare. School may have ruined Shakespeare for you, but you may not be a fan of Shakespeare. But I've got to say, I am, and it probably doesn't surprise you, I'm one of those people. I've got a few of the films. King Lear is one of my favorites. And I like listening to it. And of course, as they're talking away, I'm laughing, and the rest of them are in the house going, I don't understand a word that they're saying. What on earth is going on in here? Horatio. And all of these things that are going on. But if you listen to the poetry and the art of the use of the words and the language and how they fit together, it's wonderful. I get so excited about it and I love it. And I find all the bits funny and the jokes, and I can see people around me going, I remember doing it in English and our teacher having to go line for line to explain. It's like reading poetry or parables or the Song of Solomon. I mean, going, right, this means this, and this means this, and this means this. So it's a history book, but it's a really well-written one. Its grammar is perfect. Its use of language is amazing. It's considered one of the most inspiring pieces of literature. And I'm not talking about the message here, I'm talking about the language. So it is widely held that the author of this work was himself clearly a poet or an artist. A true wordsmith who was a gifted language expert. He's like writing in silk. In fact, it's what every person who ever uses the pulpit wants to do. They've written the message that just sounds so inspiringly beautiful. The right use of words and pauses at the right time. It's all there. Now, we don't often get it across in translations. But I think even in the English text here, it reads so easily. Think about it in comparison to trying to read Leviticus or Deuteronomy. And again, not just the content. You were reading a code. I mean, I know it's different. I'm reading a love story. I'm not reading about the fat and kidneys. But there is a harshness to the book of Leviticus. There's a harshness to the book of Genesis. There isn't the same prose and poetry that comes out that makes this so beautifully easy to read. Why everybody loves this book, even if they're not so fussed about the message, because it's just so beautiful in the way that it's written. You know, the law books are process-driven. You've got narratives like the book of Numbers, which are all over the flipping place. Even the prophetic structure and language of the book of Judges fails to even capture the same beauty of its language. Let's just grasp hold of that. Look at verse 16. Somebody just read verse 16 out. Let's see it. We could read 16 and 17, actually, because they go together. But listen to it, just even in the English.
Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if death separates you and me."
Now, did she say it exactly like that? Probably not. We rarely manage to make our conversations sound that great. But the writer of this put it, I will go where you go. I will be where you are. Your God will be my God. Oh, it's beautiful. Read it again to me. It's lovely. I can hear that all day. It's amazing. And that's the beauty of this all the way over. The person who wrote this book is talented. But it's not poetry. It's history. It's just really, really well read history. But it's like silk on your skin. It's the message every pulpit pastor wants to preach. It's the book every author wish he could write. And that's why we romanticize it and often think it's poetical. However, that it's written by a wordsmith actually gives us a clear indication as to when it was written. Because the when it was written helps us to understand who wrote it, but most importantly, why they wrote it. And I dare say that's a question you may not have asked before about the book of Ruth. Why the book of Ruth? And there are some clues we can pull together. First one's in verse 1 itself. So somebody read out Ruth 1:1.
Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons.
So we get given a nice little bit of time understanding here. And that is that this is a book that is about the time of the judges. But the way that it's written is it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, that it tells you that it wasn't written at a time when the judges ruled. It's just written about a time when the judges ruled. But there is something about this book, actually, in that sense. It has to feel kind of like one of the other case studies. You know, we finished the book of Judges. We finished the case studies. We started with Micah. We actually started with Samson. We started with Samson and Delilah, then we got Micah and the Levite, and then we got the Levite and the children of Dan. Then we got the Levite and his concubine. Then we got the people against Benjamin, and then we got Benjamin getting themselves some new wives. This could fit with that. Here's another case study of the time of the judges. Another kind of passage that gives you events that were going on in the nation at the time. And it starts just as negatively. Here is a family who decided, we don't want to live here anymore. We're leaving. And if we talk about, or remember what we studied in the book of Judges and the time frame of the judges, then we're really talking about a people who said, I'm sick of this roundabout life that we are living. We live in a land without a king. And we're good and we're bad and we're worshipping other gods, and the Lord sends somebody against us. And if we work out the time frame, then this is something that's happened in that 70-year period after Abimelech, the first king ever of Israel, that 3-year kingship, which ended in disaster and civil war. That you've had Zola and Tair, these 2 judges that barely anything is said of, and then 18 years of the Amorites who have just seized control of absolutely everything. Before you get to Jephthah and then Ibzan, Boaz. At some point between either Zola, Tair, or most likely when the Ammonites themselves came in and seized control, this family decided to leave. So the chaos of the Judges period, it gives us another bit of information about the chaos of the Judges period that we're looking in and going, well, yeah. It could actually nice and easily slip into the end of the book of Judges and be just another couple of chapters on the end of the book of Judges. Instead of it being 21 chapters, it could be 25. And we could have this here and stuck on the end. So why isn't it in the book of Judges? Well, if it was, then it would be part of the purpose of the book of Judges. Remember, the book of Judges isn't just a potted history. It's a history for a purpose, Samuel is trying to tell a story. He's trying to build up a narrative, and that narrative is how Israel got to a situation where it had a rejected king in Saul, where heaven had let go of him completely and left him. So does the book of Ruth fit into that narrative? Well, no. It's got nothing to do with Saul. There's no mention of Saul here. It doesn't help with the Saul story in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't create that narrative or build into that narrative. And that's the point. The narrative of the book of Ruth does not fit into that purpose. Yet, the timeline that's offered up by the book of Judges does instruct us the context of the book of Ruth. Ruth exists in a time frame that we've already studied. It exists in a chaotic world. And the understanding that in that time of chaos, a famine happened. Now, famines can happen in chaos. Famines can happen because of environmental issues. Famines can happen because no rain comes or the ground fails. But you'll be surprised to learn that more famines happen because of mismanagement and misrule of political elites. You're going to see it in Africa. Zimbabwe, the bread basket, as it was called, of Africa. It's a story out that's been out in the last couple of days of a woman, De Los Santos, who has stolen 1.76 billion pounds out of Angola. The country, she became the richest woman in Angola. She's stolen it from them, using government contracts and corruption to gain all of this and all of this money. So when you get that email telling you that I want to put 20 million in your bank account, I am calling you from Burkina Faso, it may actually be true. I'm sorry. No. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't reply. Don't give them anything. But the whole understanding that a famine situation that caused one family to say, I'm not sticking around for this anymore. It's a big thing to give up your inheritance, to walk away from who you are, who God is, to marry your sons off to foreign women and other gods and other religions, and to really truly turn your back on all of it. That story means a lot to us. But that narrative of trying to express why Saul was rejected, how Israel got there, that doesn't apply to the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth doesn't add to that narrative. Another reason, again, of course, why we have some instruction is the writing style. It clearly isn't written by Samuel. It's so different to the book of Judges. It's too well written. It's in a style unlike the ones that Samuel uses as a prophet. Even though it is clearly a prophetic book, which has a typological narrative of relationship of Israel, the Gentile church, and Jesus, and therefore is written by a prophet, it's not written by the prophet Samuel and the judge. The last reason is, of course, found in the very last few verses. Just turn with me to Ruth chapter 4 and let's read verse 17. You're all very polite.
So her woman neighbours gave the child a nickname, which is Naomi has a son. They called him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, who was the father of David.
Because this history doesn't end with Saul, it goes beyond him. In fact, it doesn't mention Saul at all. So what we understand is this is a history with David at the end of it. So it's a story about, in a sense, David's genealogy. And that bit there, we'll get to it again in chapter 4, goes from Pharez, which is one of Judah's sons, right the way through to David. 10 generations. Which is important because Pharez was cursed. Ask away. Why is David coming through this generation, through this genealogy? Because he has to be a son of Judah. Pharez was Judah's son. All of Judah's other sons had died. But Pharez was brought. But the way that Pharez was brought was by Tamar dressing as a prostitute and sleeping with her father-in-law. So Pharez was a child of Judah, but not through conventional means. Now, we are told, in fact, the Lord told through Moses and through Jacob that Judah would rule. That the scepter would not leave Judah until Shiloh would come. And this is that fulfillment of that story. David came through that line. Now, this line also includes Rahab. So there are more than one Gentile woman that's in that. But remember, there is an important phrase here. I mean, ultimately, Ibzan, it tells us, had 60 children, and 30 of them he married off to Gentiles, and the other 30 he married off to Gentiles. So he seemed to have no problem with it whatsoever. There's a whole kind of story, and we looked at that narrative that's there. But there is important to know the book of Ruth goes on. It's going on to here. It's going on to David, not to Saul. And that's the third and final reason why this isn't part of the book of Judges. Why, even though it's a case study that's inside the time of Judges, it's a story all on its own because it has a lesson all on its own. And as such, the narrative isn't giving us Saul's background. It's giving us David's background. Because David was the king who was accepted. And David was the king that the Lord said, I will not lift my mercy from your son. His throne will endure forever. And of course, the reference being to Jesus in the end, who is the son of David. So in a sense, because Jesus is the last son of David, this is not just the story of David, this is the story of Jesus. It's the story of Jesus and how he comes about. But of course, that's to us as the church, because we believe that Jesus is the Messiah. To Jews today, they do not. So they don't look at the book of Ruth and say, that's the story of Jesus. They say that's the story of how David came about. But, okay, that's great. So you've decided to contain in the history books, a history of how David came about. So why have we just got Ruth's history? Why haven't we got Obed's history? Why haven't we got Jesse's history? Why haven't we got any other history here? Why have we just got this one character's history that kind of comes along? And that's an important question. And as such, the time it was written was sometime after the book of Judges. It wasn't written during the time of Judges. It was written after the time of Judges. Now, many theologians think it was written, the book of Ruth, quite some time after the Judges. In fact, a lot of them even go as far as to say Ezra wrote this in the post-exile period. So you'd had all the periods of the kings, you've had the 70 years exile in Babylon, and then Ezra decides to write the history of Ruth the Moabitess that comes in. However, there is a challenge to that. Now, there's a good reason for coming up with it. You know, the history books which follow this, the Samuels, the Kings, the Chronicles, they don't have an author. They have a series of authors. They have the scribes. They're written as the time is going on. They're books that stayed open for time periods that went on and had lengths, to which Chronicles is completed by Ezra. And Ezra actually invented the scribes. He came up with the whole thing and brought that whole process about. So the history books we're going to go into, they are written in that style. So it's understandable why they think the book of Ruth is written like that. But there's something in that we just read that tells you that it has to have been written before that. Because the reason we know that it wasn't written by a pre-exile time is because what David was called in verse 17. What was he called? And you're all looking at that thinking, that's a trick question. Well, he was called David. He was not called King David. Now think about that. Think about that. This was a narrative that was written at a time when it was important enough that David had a narrative. But not in a time when David was yet king. And rather than saying that this is a broad period of time that could have been written at any time, you've actually just immediately narrowed it down to a very short period of time. A period of time when you've got a David who's on the run. A David who has got some followers. A David who has been chased by Saul, who has been chased by Achish, who has had to behave in a mad kind of way to get away from the Philistines, who's living in a cave with his family. But he's not yet been made king because he isn't called King David. And that's a very specific time frame. But it's also an incredibly perilous one for David. Think about that. If Saul finds him, he's going to kill him. If the Philistines find him, they're going to kill him. He's carrying Goliath's sword around with him. He's got nowhere to go. Even his family have had to flee from their home. There is no safe place for him to go. This is that time period. And you have got to say that when a man is in a lifetime, when he's a fugitive, and he's hiding in a cave, and he's running away, a time where he had no home, it would seem incredible to consider that he decided one day to sit down, or somebody decided to sit down and write a poetry book. He hasn't got the time. He's got lookouts looking out to make sure that Saul and his troops are not coming at him, or anybody else that wants to make a name for themselves by killing David. He has to watch his back and taste his own food. And when you start to realize the time frame, that process that comes, then it makes it really clear. In fact, it helps us to understand this, because the question as to why the book of Ruth was written at a time when such things would not be a priority. Let's be honest. If you were in that situation, would this book be a priority? Would this story that people narrow down to being the Bible's version of Wuthering Heights, would it be important at that time when you were on the lam, you were on the run? Would it be important to sit down there and write such a book? Of course it wouldn't. And that, when you start to investigate, you go, hang on a second. What am I reading here? Why am I reading this? Where is this come from? Why have you written this book when you're living in a cave? What's going on? Where's this come from? Why does a narrative of David's descendants need to come? And why is that narrative only focusing on Ruth and on nobody else? Why doesn't it focus on Perez? Why doesn't it focus on any of the people through the time period, or any of his father or his grandfather? Why does it focus on his great-grandmother and nobody else? It doesn't even really focus on Boaz. This is a story about what Ruth does. And in the scheme of things, why is that important in this moment, that has to be written? Now, when David was king, that would make sense. We want lots of books to talk about our wonderful king and how he came about. He can commission all kinds of people to do that kind of thing. We'll make it gold leaf. But he's not. He's on the run and he needs it. And for those people who were convinced that the reason that the book of Ruth was written was to justify or give some historical justification as to why David has a Gentile great-grandmother. They have to, in order to stop some preclusion to the throne, they have to understand two things. The first is nobody cared. Not about David at that time. Not enough to go, hang on a second, he can't lead us. His great-grandmother was a Moabitess. And there's no such preclusion anyway that would stop him. Because if there was such a preclusion, then Jesus can't be our king. So there was no preclusion whatsoever. There was no rule. There was nothing to stop it. It isn't something that's written to justify Ruth. But yet here it is, focusing on this one very specific person, whilst David is on the run and hiding on in a cave and not yet a king. Some reason this book has been commissioned, and the importance of setting out David's lineage by proving that this Moabitess had this experience. And that really does soak up what would seem like all the likely options. Now all of a sudden, the idea that it's a book of poetry is just nonsense, because that would be the last thing you would do unless you wanted to cheer everybody up. Shall we read some poetry tonight, friends? I'll go back to Saul. It soaks up all of the ideas. But that specific time frame does bring us to a situation which gives us a great deal of clarity as to why Ruth, out of all of David's forefathers, was singled out. And that answer is found in 1 Samuel 22 and verses 1 to 4. And this gives us the specificity of this book. 1 Samuel 22 verses 1 to 4.
So David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Soon his brothers and all his other relatives joined him there. Then others began coming, men who were in trouble or in debt, or who were just discontented, until David was a captain of about 400 men. Later David went to Mizpah in Moab, where he asked the king, "Please allow my father and mother to live here with you until I know what God is going to do for me." So David's parents stayed in Moab with the king during the entire time David was living in his stronghold.
Do you see it? And the timeline gives us a specific that it has to have been at this time in his life that he had the book written, because he was about to go to the king of Moab and ask him to look after the mother and father that he loved. As he was about to have them taken care of. Now think about, David, they left all of their families, and the Philistines came and killed the women and took them away. And the men were ready to kill David there and then for doing it. There was nowhere that was safe. Nowhere that was safe. Nowhere in Israel, nowhere in Philistine. So he goes to the enemy, and they are the enemy. Moab, the child of Lot. One whom the Lord honored the agreement that Abraham gave, but when that land was taken from Moab, they didn't. The Moabites, the king of who was so fat that when Ehud stabbed him in the stomach, nobody found the sword. The Moabites, who would later become a vassal state of Solomon under his rulership, providing him with all the sheepskins that he needed and wanted. Moab, who would rebel, who Jehoshaphat would go to war against, and see the king of Moab sacrifice his own son by sword and fire in front of the whole army in order to get his great god Chemosh to fight for them. Moab, the godless state that was the son of the person that God saved, but who rejected God for Chemosh. To these Gentiles, a book expressing the importance of David, but showing that in his lineage, a faithful Moabitess, Ruth, who gave her lot and her all to the great God. Let your God become my God. But the truth of this is originally he was your God, Ruth. He was the God of Moab, because he was the God of Lot. You've just forgotten that. And like the Gentile world, to know that God is not the God of Israel alone, but yes, he is the God of the whole earth. A book was written to remind them that your lineage is in the king's lineage. Your lineage is in the significant person's lineage. Your story and the story of faithfulness is the story that is here. And that's the story you need to get. David's life was about to get considerably more complicated. Protection for the parents he loved was the requirement. He needed a well-written reason. And the book of Ruth is a well-written reason as to why. And as such, this is not a narrative to give us poetry. It's not a narrative to justify David's kingship, even with a Gentile ancestor. It's a narrative written in order to show Gentiles why David is significant to them as well. David is significant to them as well. David is not just significant to Israel. The Star of David is not just significant to the nation of Israel. It is significant to all the Gentile world, because the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords will sit upon the throne of David. Moab, hear what your faithful daughter was. Hear how your faithful daughter is in this lineage. Hear, Gentile world, how significant David is. Hear this history. Right in the middle of Israel's history is a history that is written to the Gentile world about why Israel's king would be significant to them. And knowing that reveals why the Holy Spirit took such a situation and inspired the writer to not just give something for the moment, but something for all ages. The book of Ruth is written for that moment. But that message is still as true today as it was to Mizpah and the Moabites. Ruth was a Moabite, but she was also a Gentile, and she is significant in the lineage of the king of Israel, not because she was purchased and then she laid back and just popped out children, but because she was a hard-working woman who did not go into this situation thinking, if I play my cards right, I can be the great-grandmother of the king of Israel. She went into this situation when Orpah left the situation, because what Naomi said was not the ramblings of a bitter woman who thought she had no hope. It was the truth of the physical situation that she was in. She made the declaration as clear as a bell as she could to both of the girls. Now, for honest sake, they went so far and she allowed them to. But when that honest sake was met, she, as a mother-in-law, released them from their vow. And it's important that you know that. They were released from it. Ruth makes a decision whilst released from her legal bounding. She could have gone home. And Naomi lays it on the line. Here it is. I've got nothing. And we could be going back and starving to death, while other people around us have got everything. I may go back to that place and get no kindness whatsoever. And even if I get kindness, there's no guarantee you're going to get any. Because you're a foreigner. You don't belong. Your face doesn't fit. And there may be trouble. In fact, we see some of that trouble when some of the men of the field say, oh, she's a Moabitess. She's the Moabitess. Always she's the Moabitess. But by the very fact that she married Elimelech's son, she was not a Moabitess anymore. By the laws of inheritance, she was now Jewish. She had now become Jewish, but they would not recognize that. She was a Moabite. Even Boaz called her a Moabite. They rejected her, and that's the laying it on the line. But here's the next laying on the line. Because here is the next legal requirement. Just like Tamar, whose husband was wicked, and so the Lord killed him. Whose brother, whose job it was to raise up an heir, decided not to, so the Lord took him. And whose other brother was too young to be considered as marriage, and so she was told to wait 20 years till he was ready. And then Judah thinking, hang on, she's a bit of a black widow, this one. I'm not letting him have the third son, the only one that's left, and gave him nothing. Like that kind of story that's in there. She was this Levitical marriage. Naomi's laying at the line and saying, listen, your only chance of marriage, remarriage, is if I have another child. And I'm an old woman. So that's not going to happen. But on the off chance that it does happen, are you going to wait for that toddler? You're going to help him as a grown woman, already been married for 10 years, but not had any kids. So you're probably in your 30s already. You're going to wait till you're 50 to marry a 20-year-old along the line, in the hope that he's going to get you pregnant. Oh, and by the way, he won't be your husband. He'll just be his job to get you pregnant. So, listen, Ruth, go home. Because you don't want that to be your life. That's nobody who chooses that life. Nobody chooses that life. Ruth chose that life. She didn't choose the life in the hope that everything would go well. She was prepared to go and die. A spinster, a widow. She was going to die with nothing. But then she didn't go there to die. She went there to work. And she was prepared to work under all the persecution and all the difficulty and all the challenges that came along. That is the story. Two important scriptures. We've already read one. Verses 16 to 17. Great poetically, but also very true. Entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people. Your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried, and the Lord do so to me. And more also, if anything but death parts you from me. She's just signed her life away with no promise of any future. And no declaration to say that she's hoping that it's all going to work out in the best possible way. She's accepted her fate and situation. And she's done it without any obligation, because she's been released from obligation. So she has chosen to do this. And a woman that's so bitter, she's changed her name to Bitter. And you know, that's the person you've just given everything up, and the woman you're going to live with will moan about everything. Because she's just changed her name to Moaning Minnie. She's just released to you that not only are you going to live without anything, without any food, without the prospect of ever having a child or anything, the woman you're about to shack up with is going to complain about biliary, about everything. And she still willingly did it. And that fact sets her apart. Sets her apart so much that this is what Boaz says about her. Somebody just read for me Ruth chapter 2, and let's read verses 10 to 12. Ruth 2, verses 10 to 12.
So she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, Why have I found favour in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? And Boaz answered and said to her, It has been fully reported to me all that you have done since your mother-in-law, for your mother-in-law, since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother, and the land of your birth, and you have come to a people whom you did not know before. The Lord repay your work, and full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge.
Like the Shulamite, she was picked, seen over the pampered princesses of Jerusalem. And we always say this. I say this to the men, but I also say it to you women, because it is 2020. Find yourself a worker, not a shirker. Trophy wives and husbands have to be polished and looked after. But they don't do any good. They just look nice for a while. Find somebody who will work in the field with you. In Song of Solomon, the Shulamite tells that she's afraid because she's sunburnt. She's blackened by the sun, which she thinks to be her weakest flaw and feature. It's the thing that is going to massively put Solomon off from her. Because all of the daughters of Jerusalem, they're lying in their aloes and all of their makeup and their spices and their mix, and they're pale skinned and they've stayed out of the sun and everything's beautiful and they're wearing all the white robes and all of their parts are in the right place. And here she is, she works on the field, and it's not even her own field, it's her brother's field. Her field doesn't even get worked on. But that's what the Shulamite found. What the beloved finds attractive about the Shulamite. The thing she thinks that is her weakness is, I'm a working girl, is what he finds the most attractive about her. Ruth's faithfulness is what Boaz, in the end, finds beautiful about her. Whether she's beautiful or not, she's certainly young. But he finds that. Now the other guy, the guy who Boaz has to kind of work his way around so that he doesn't marry Ruth, who's actually in line in front, he thinks she's beautiful too, because she comes with land. Her land is beautiful. Her fields are ample. But he's not that interested in her, because the minute that he says, well, you know, you've got to raise up an heir and an issue for her, hang on. No, I'm not interested in that. I just want a land. Well, you don't get a land. You've got to raise up somebody for that. Oh, no, I'm not interested in that. That's what's faithful about it. And that's what is wonderful about this. Her hard work and dedication to God. When the situation seemed bleak and hopeless, this is what made her significant. That's what was written. A letter to Moab. I only stand because of your faithfulness, Moab. Because of the faithfulness of one of your daughters. Now, please, as my kin is your kin, protect my parents along this line. So that leaves us with who the author was of the book of Ruth. Now, this isn't something we can say with absolute definite, this is who it was. But if we put all of the things that we have found together, this writer was a poet and an excellent writer, creative, and a prophet, prophetic, able to worship and glorify God in great prose, who was very close to the situation of the salvation of David's parents. And quite frankly, somebody who knew that the lineage of the Moabites was important to the moment. And somebody who prophetically knew the significance of David and of Ruth. Well, we can't say with clarity, but we can say with good probability that all of that fits the character of one. David himself. And that this is most likely the authorship of David, writing about his own great-grandmother. Like the child doing the book report on that grandfather that was in the war, taking in his medals, here is David writing to the king of Moab. Not embellishing, but writing about that. Hence why he doesn't call himself King David, because that would be pretty big-headed. But the one who shows that this lineage and this life is because, you know, we talked on Sunday morning about quiverfuls, shooting the arrow, taking on the spiritual child. And we are, as Christine said it was my favourite subject. This idea of the Joshua generation, the next generation. And be clear, we're not talking about the young people. We're talking about the young Christians. And I think Anna wrote this on Workplace after, and I found it a blessing. I know a lot of you liked it and also commented that they went to see then their grandmother, who was the reason that Linda came to church. And of course, Linda is the reason that Anna and Daniel are here at church. Let me say that here in the sense that invited them, they made their own decisions as to whether they were going to stay or not. They come along, and that's important. Linda didn't save them, and neither did Marlene save Linda. The Lord saved them. But she shot Linda, and Linda shot them. And the point of an arrow is not just to get somebody into the faith, but it's to make them go further than you are. To strengthen them and teach them all that you know so that they go beyond you and do more than you ever did. We always say in the ministry team our important role is to do ourselves out of a job. That's the case, and that's what we are. But the joy that we're looking for is in that. Here is David saying, I'm going to go further than my grandma. But her faithfulness brought me here. Her faithfulness is the reason I'm here. And her faithfulness, we'll look at all the things that go on, the intricacies of the situation in these next 3 weeks. But what does chapter 1 do? Chapter 1 tells us, when all the people who were the children had no faith, the one who was not the child had all the faith. She had the faith. And David is a great-grandson of Boaz. But had Ruth had children with her first husband? Had her first husband had faith, David wouldn't be. It's the rejection, the pain, the absolute pouring out of saying, I don't want anything to do with that nation Israel anymore, and I am leaving and going here, out of that utter tragedy of, and there's no other word for it, backsliding. Not only was David born, but so was Jesus. Now think about that. Elimelech looked around and saw nothing but chaos and no food, and the only place that food should be. There was no food, there was a famine. Grain and bread always represents the word. There was no word. Now everybody else was prepared to work at that, stick around and stay for it. But he wasn't. Elimelech said no more. I'm going to go to Moab where they've got a different word. I'm going to go and find a different food. I'm going to feed my children on something different. I'm going to take them over there because they've got something that you haven't got anymore. The faith in God, the faithfulness of God, the looking around and doing that stupid thing that sometimes Christians do and go, well, we're going to that place, it's full of hypocrites. Well, of course it is. Join the club, we've got t-shirts. The realization, but no, he cast it off and he went and it cost him his life. Do you know what Elimelech means? That's right. My God is king. His own name declared that if you confess that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. Every time he signed his name, he declared that and didn't believe it. And just to really rub it in, he called his sons, Mahlon and Shilon, unhealthy and puny. You're going to say, Dad, do you want to say something to me? Is there a reason for this name? It sounded good, son. Orpha meant stiff-necked. And all of that's gone. Now Naomi decides to go back. Friends, we're hoping that people come back. Because it was a wreck. It was the ashes. It was the cinders. It was burnt to the ground. There was nothing left. There was no food. And too many left to find food elsewhere. And we say, Lord, bring them back. Bring them back. And when they came back, the people of Bethlehem didn't say, what are you doing here? They said how good it is to see you, Naomi. And Naomi said, don't call me that. I'm bitterness. Well, the Lord isn't going to let you keep that name for long, Naomi. Because your actual name is Naomi. And Naomi means pleasantness. And the reason is because the Lord has given you a Ruth. And Ruth's name means desirable. He's giving you something desirable. And from that, hope will be lifted. Hope will come down. Hope will pour out upon you. And yet, in the next chapter, we'll see Naomi clap her hands and say, the Lord God is with us. She can't hold on to her bitterness much longer. When she came back to the house of bread. Friends, they need to come back to the house of bread. They need to come back to the Word of God. They need to come back and find once again that very food that was good in their stomach. They need, like David, who cried out and said, oh, how I wish for the waters of the springs of Bethlehem. That they might desire the waters again in the house of bread. That they might desire the Spirit and the Word. That they might let go of their adventures elsewhere and realize the truth of what they let go. And come in and find that God is a God of restoration. And He intends to restore. Amen. There's much more I suppose we could say about this, so I will open it now to a time of questions if anybody's got one. Or anything that they want an answer to that hasn't been. Use your microphone so that everybody who's online might grab hold of. But otherwise, I don't have any more to say here on chapter 1. We will get on to chapter 2, where Ruth meets Boaz for the first time. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask?
So are we to understand that David must have written this as a journal type thing, almost, but when he had a few minutes here and there, put it together, bit to bit tomorrow?
I wouldn't say necessarily that he wrote it as a journal. I would say that it was deliberately written for the purpose of giving to. Now, in terms of when he got the opportunity to write it, yeah, you're absolutely right. The fact is, he didn't have a palace, he didn't have a room, he had a cave. I mean, where did he get that's it. Where did he even get the paper from? That was, yeah. So, in a sense, the imperative of the letter is made even more by the fact that the resources to write it were not really readily available to him. The situation and everything wasn't. And it's kind of like, I don't even, when I went to uni with a guy like this. Did none of the work whatsoever. And they're the kind of people that they're just like cats. They always land on their feet. And I was looking at him, I said, I bet you end up being Prime Minister. Because it's just going to, they're the kind of people that are like that. It doesn't really matter. And that's the case here he is, David, in a cave. And he still writes the hands and feet off everybody else in the Bible. But then he wrote half his Psalms in a field. So he's got used to this idea, really, of using his time wisely. I'm going to do time management, that David's the man, really, for this process, because the problem is when he gets to become king, his time management goes out the window. He's always in the wrong place at the wrong time. But at this moment, when everything's right, yeah, it's a big thing, isn't it, really? For him to write that, the resources that would be. And I'm going to sit here and say, You might go home now and look at a lot of commentaries and go, oh, I'm not sure. You'll get plenty that say Ezra wrote it. You'll get plenty that say maybe Nathan wrote it. Maybe the prophet Gad wrote it. Maybe Samuel wrote it. And I'm going to, because I don't like giving you half answers, so I'm going to put my money where my mouth is and say, I feel that I've got enough evidence here to say this is why it was written and this is who wrote it. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and that's probably true in a sense. Yeah, that people write it. I mean, I think people still write in their head now, really, along the line. But you're absolutely right. It's harder to do so now. There's more distractions that come along. But I have got to say that in his case, he'd got plenty of distractions, which was every other person trying to kill him. So those are on our line. And we wonder at the same time, battle plan, mum and dad safe, grandmother's history. Well, that's true. Yeah. Well, and that's it. And a lot of the Psalms are prophetic. Some of the Psalms are even clearly as though in prayer he was listening to conversations that were going on in heaven. You know, you get that one, the Why Do the Nations Rage? That's a conversation between the Godhead going on there. That is, the Lord said that, yeah, sit at my right hand while I make your enemies my footstool. All those kind of phrases that are there. This is that comparison. It does give you that marvel, but for me, it takes a book that I always liked anyway, and a story that I like because I am an old romantic in that kind of way anyway, and makes it actually quite significant even more so, that it was written to save his mum and dad, which is beautiful even in that process. It was written to save his mum and dad by declaring to people who were his natural enemies, it's our God. Because when you see that, because we think of Israel as the Israel that Jesus had to battle with, the ones that couldn't wait till the Gentiles were on the outside. But we look at the Israel of David in this moment, who, like the Lord, loved his enemies while they were still his enemies. And that is why you hear that phrase, a man after God's own heart. And also why the Lord really isn't asking us too much when he says, love one another as I have loved you. Amen. The Lord bless you all. Did you have a question before you finished? Yeah. Why did Ruth stay with Naomi? And in a kind of sense, that is the $1 million question, isn't it? Because in all honesty, and this is like Christian honesty time, who would have made that call in this room? I wouldn't have made that call. I mean, I'm not a woman, but even if I was a woman, I would not have made that call in that situation. I would have been like Arthur. You know, I've done my honor bit. I've walked with you this far. You've released me from this. Thank goodness. Thank goodness for that. No, I'm going. Because it's the case. And that's the point. Now, the good Christian answer, of course, would be, yes, I would absolutely walk through the fires of hell for you, Jesus. Absolutely, in every kind of shape or form. But sometimes we're only prepared to do that when we've got an absolute ideological belief that good things will happen. This book, this chapter makes it abundantly clear Ruth had no such thought. In fact, when Boaz starts being kind to her, she doesn't get it. And she probably doesn't get it because the world that she's from, that's not true. In the same way when people become Christians, and if they are treated the way that they should be treated according to the way that the Lord has put within us, they don't get it. They're moved by it. And that's my testimony. A man who knew the Lord when I didn't, who showed incredible favor and kindness that I didn't get from anybody else or in any other thing, that moved me enough to want to know who this Jesus